So I'm Carolyn Routledge. I've been working for the last few months on the Eton Myers collection here at Birmingham University. And I have a background in collections and Egyptology, and done a bit of excavating on the side as well. So thanks to Birmingham Egyptology for asking me to come and speak about Myers as far as their sort of theme of collection of collectors. So I'm going to look at William Joseph Myers as a collector and a little bit about his collection and how looking at a collector can tell you more than you might think. That's the basic. There we go. Okay. So the University of Birmingham is privileged to have on loan this collection of more than 500 ancient Egyptian objects from the college. And their collection, they call the Myers collection. That's primarily because their collection originates in bulk, anyway, from a single person, and that's Major William Joseph Myers. They have a number of things from some other donors that were given to Eton College, but the bulk of the collection is from this one single collector. So these objects are all here in Birmingham, just so you know. They're all things that are down in the Celio campus. Eton Myers collection was known in the past to the Eton College community, but was largely unknown to the wider world, including many Egyptologists until fairly recently. And that really is marked by this century, the 21st century, when some highlights of the collection were sent on a world tour, basically. They were shown at Eton College after a large period of cataloging and preparation, and then they went out to a number of major museums around the world. So they went to the Metropolitan Museum in New York, the Rijksmuseum in Leiden, and then off on a tour in Japan, along with some objects from Durham University. And that was when people sort of woke up to what was really in the collection. They all knew it had been there, but access to it had been quite limited, and so people just weren't quite sure what was in the collection. And that raised everybody's awareness of how good a collection it was and how interesting, and that it was really then recognized internationally as one of the most significant decorative art collections of ancient Egyptian material anywhere in the world. The Myers bequest to Eton College included around 1,300 objects, so it was quite substantial. And the entire Eton Myers collection now, including things from other donors, is around 2,100 objects. So the fact that Birmingham have 500 of those, more than 500, is quite a significant percentage of the total collection. So this picture is a display of the Eton Myers collection at Eton many years ago. And for those of you who have been out to see the collection at Celio, you'll probably recognize those cabinets down in the corner. They're sitting, or at least 4 of them are sitting now at Celio with objects on display as we speak. And then this is just the cover from the New York exhibition. So the other thing that's interesting about the Eton Myers collection, as far as the material from Myers, the 1,300 or so objects, is they're considered today to be one of the last major private 19th century collections to exist intact. Almost all of the others have been dispersed in one way or another. And so this gives a real window into what collectors were looking at when they were trying to create their collections at this time period. So in broad terms, the Eton Myers collection is noted for its very high quality and varied collection of Egyptian faience. This is the most famous part of the collection. And these include amulets, shabti, bowls, chalices, all sorts of objects that most people immediately recognize as being ancient Egyptian. And in Birmingham, we also have a sample of some of the other kinds of objects they have in the collection. These include Greco-Roman portrait panels and masks, pottery vessels, and then some non-Myers material that includes stone tools. At Eton, the collection also includes human remains, textiles, statuary, and jewelry. So in this slide, I'm showing you some of the items that are at Eton College and not here. So we've got this lovely pectoral. This is the current display as it is now at Eton College, and then this is a mummy, part of a coffin that belonged to 18th dynasty builder, overseer of builders. It's one of the stars of the collection. So the majority of Myers' Egyptian collection is at Eton, and this is according to his will. This is what he wanted. He wanted his collection intact in its entirety to be deposited at Eton College. However, there are some items that have shown up in other places, and so the collection is not intact. So what we have here are some examples. So we have this small alabaster dish that's at National Museum of Liverpool. They have a few items that came in to their collection, not directly from Myers, but are known to come from his collection. In the middle, we have several objects from the British Museum. They have a more extensive collection. So we have a shabti and a Coptic sock. And then the V&A have a few things. So theirs tends to not be the ancient Egyptian material, but to be more, you might consider historic Egyptian material. So this is a moth lamp from Cairo. They also have some tiles and some Islamic pottery, that kind of thing. So later material. And some of this was done before he died. Some was done at his wish. Some of it was the fact that some objects from the Egyptian collection were actually with relatives. And when the selection for Eton College was done, they only took what was in his home. So that's what their selection was from. So these other things tend to have come through being dispersed after his death by family members or by specific requests. We know his collection extended far beyond ancient Egyptian items, and so there was awful lot of textiles, carpets, material from other places he'd been visiting in the world that have ended up dispersed and nobody knows where they are. His name isn't generally connected with them anymore. So there's an aspect of his collecting activities we can't really reconstruct. So besides the obvious aesthetic qualities of the collection, and the thing that many people have commented on, what is it that we can really get from looking at this collection and Myers as a collector? So I've picked out three things to kind of focus on for this talk. The first thing is that the period that the collection was formed was a period of intense collecting generally in Egypt by Europeans and North Americans. And it marked a critical period in the formation of many major European museum collections and American museum collections. And knowing about this informs us about the types of objects that were collected, not just by private collectors, but by the major museums. And what Myers is selecting helped us see how that worked more globally. And it also informs on us on why we have the collections that we now curate and display in museums. So as one scholar put it, this is a period when buyers could buy when significant art works were still to be had. So the assumption is that at the period after Myers, there really wasn't much on the art market that you could buy. And so that collecting became a very different proposition and largely came from excavations. So it was a different kind of way of acquiring ancient Egyptian collections. It also informs us about the nature of colonial collections. And it allows us to think about what's the correct context for interpretation and display of a colonial collection. What is looted? What is subject to return? How do you make those decisions? And this, of course, is very, very relevant to what the discussion is going on right now within the museum world. And then the last thing I was going to be looking at in this talk anyway, it's not the last thing we can do with collectors, but is to look at the reconstruction of life stories of objects. And this is around what sometimes called provenance. So what we can learn from looking at Myers as a collector is trying to reconstruct where things are from. And the reality is for these 19th century collections, and this includes a lot of the things that came into museums at this time, nobody recorded where they were from or their context at all. And by looking at the collector and what we can figure out about the collector, we can sometimes reconstruct more about the provenance, more about the context, and we can return a life story to an object. And that connects it to its culture, to the people who created and used it, and then its life sort of after when it was found and then ended up making its way to Europe. And this is important to bring meaning to objects because otherwise they're just pretty artworks. So it's one reason, again, to look at collectors in particular. So who is Major William Joseph Myers? Well, I've done a little looking, but this is going to be based on not knowing a lot from inside, I guess. This is an outsider's very quick look at who he was, because in fact it's very rarely talked about as to who he really was. So he was a member of the landed gentry, having inherited an estate called Porter's Park in Shanley, Hertfordshire. He was born in 1858 in London as the eldest son of Thomas Boron Myers of Porter's Park, who was a magistrate, and his wife Margaret, who was the daughter of Henry Melville, who was the canon of St. Paul's Cathedral. And he's kind of fun because he seems like quite a character. And he was noted to be the most popular preacher in London during his day. And they have these lovely pictures of him with this wild, crazy hair looking like, yeah, he was probably quite a good speaker and quite interesting. So Myers himself was named after his grandfather, William Joseph Myers of Porter's Park. And he's the one who bought Porter's Park. He bought the estate in 1850. And his grandfather, if I'm right, and this is based on Burke's only, because I don't have, again, insider information, but he seems to be from Liverpool. And in fact, William Joseph Myers' father was from Liverpool, which even back in that day, Liverpool was not London. It was not the center of the world, shipping capital. And that's what his grandfather seems to have done. He was a merchant originally and made his money through shipping. And he had a company called W.J. Myers Co. Shipping. And prior to that, the family has quite a long history of being significant in the Liverpool, Preston area. And they seem to have made a lot of money through the cotton trade. So the little sort of anecdote is that William Joseph Myers was the first person to figure that maybe guano from South America might make good fertilizer and he could make a lot of money. And he got the first exclusive contract with government in Peru to bring guano to England. And he thought he was going to make a lot of money. He probably did, but then the government in Peru decided that the deal they'd made, the exclusive deal they made with him wasn't good enough. And they canceled his contract and gave it to someone else at a much higher rate. But I don't think they made much money because the rate was too high, but anyway. So it was after that he lost the contract, he bought Porter's Park. So the idea is that there's a reason why I'm telling you all this. It'll come up later. But it might explain why there's objects in the National Museum Liverpool, because there's this family connection. And then William Joseph Myers, on leave, took an extensive trip to South America that we know very little about, but that might be part of the reason, is there's this family connection to South America through the shipping company. Because even after the guano, the shipping company, which stayed in the family, continued to do runs to South America, which is very big for Liverpool during this period. So Myers was the eldest son, as was his father was the eldest son. And so Myers had the rights to Porter's Park, which he sold in 1896. That ended the family's owning of that estate. So what we have is we've got Myers, and that is Porter's Park. As it is today, it's now 6 luxury apartments, all worth almost 2 million or more. So you have that by 6. But it didn't look like that in his day. That one of the people who did a major outside renovation. The core of the house is quite old, but it's sort of buried inside this outer new, well, it's not a new facade to us, but at the time, so that's not how Myers would have seen it. So he gives you a little window into who he was. He's not aristocracy. He's not London wealth exactly, though he had these connections through his mother's family to, some fairly important people, influential people. But yeah, he's kind of money a little bit. So Myers attended Eton College from 1871 to 1875, and then Sandhurst. And after that, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 16th Foot, and later was part of the King Royal Rifle Corps. So he immediately went into the military, and he saw action fairly quickly, being in the Zulu Wars in 1879. He later served in Egypt, Gibraltar, Cyprus, India, and Afghanistan. And he left the army in 1894. In 1899, he rejoined to serve in the Boer War. And that's where he was killed. He arrived, and 4 days later, he died at the Battle of Ladysmith, which was a big defeat for the British. So this is not necessarily he's in there, but this is the first British in Egypt in 1882. And this is what he would have seen. Between his different trips, the Sphinx gets moved to the sand. So when he first arrived, the Sphinx is covered with sand, and later he sees it excavated. And this is kind of a sad picture. That is the dead being removed from the battlefield at Ladysmith. So based on sort of available information, Myers started collecting as a child, and like many did in the past, and maybe they still do. I know I did. Your first collection is a stamp collection. And that's where he seemed to start collecting. He collected immediately on his trips. So when he went to South Africa, he made a substantial collection of Zulu weapons and trophies, and then he continued this pattern wherever he went. So when he first traveled to Egypt, he was one of the early arrivals of the British after they were invited to come by the Egyptian government to put down revolt that was going on in the country. And he was there from 1882 to 1887. He then returned to Egypt as a visitor in 1894, 1896, and 1897. And these are the ones we know about. He may have gone more often. So during each of these trips, he seems to have gone out and done collecting in Egypt. So his collection grew quite substantially throughout those years. Not all of his activities have been that well documented, and his unpublished diaries are mainly sort of personal aid memoir. They don't say that much. They make notes that he probably would know more about, but from our point of view, he's not giving us lovely lists of what he bought and where he bought it, and who he bought it from, all that kind of stuff. But recently there has been a sort of mystery that I just thought I'd share with you. There's a mummy in Durban, South Africa, this one, that is attached to Myers' name. There was a tag that said it was really just Myers' mummy. And they have a lovely little panel with his picture and some objects on it. And this, I'm not quite sure. I haven't done the looking. I haven't heard that Eton's done the looking. They might have, but that Given he did make several trips to South Africa, they don't seem to be immediately after his trips to Egypt. And of course, his final trip, he was only there 4 days. It doesn't seem like he'd taken money all the way there, but so that's something for some further research. So in Egypt, he collected Islamic, Coptic, historical material as well as Egyptian objects. He collected, in most people's opinion, from the point of view of what attracted him, not from any kind of academic Egyptological interest. He clearly had an attraction to faience, and he collected a lot of green and blue objects as well as traditional faience objects. But in general, he was guided by the opinion of one particular person, and that was Emile Bruges. And they became great friends. He was the keeper of the Bulak Museum, which became the Cairo Museum. Bruges was born in 1842, so he was older than William Joseph Myers. He is the younger brother of Egyptologist Heinrich Bruges, who was the director of the School of Egyptology in Cairo, and who was credited with being the first to decipher the demotic on the Rosetta Stone. So he's, within German Egyptology, he's seen as a real foundational figure. Emile Bruges, in 1881, oversaw the removal of the royal cache at Deir el-Bakri in his role working for Mariette and Maspero, the French heads of the Egyptian Antiquities Service. And so he's got a certain notoriety around that. Some think he did as well as he could in the circumstances, and others blame him for making a mess of that. So if you go on Wikipedia, you'll see some very harsh things about him. But there's much more measured information about him than that. But I just thought I'd point that out, is that he has a mixed reputation, but he has this claim to fame. And that's what this picture relates to. This is him here, and I think that's Maspero at the cache. Bruges was in post from 1881 to 1914. So he really was in control of the Egyptian antiquities at the museum for this very crucial period of collecting. He was instrumental in the formation of the national collection in Egypt. So he decided what went into the national collection, what didn't. He worked with most of the major museum representatives in their acquisitions. He worked with the major excavators who he was allowed to choose from what they'd excavated, what went into the national collection. And he worked with people like Myers in helping him form his collection. So Bruges was responsible to what the Egyptian government decided was going to leave the country and what objects could be sold through their museum gift shop, which had real artifacts. And he would make arrangements for what was legally exported. So it should be remembered that the national collection in Egypt, at this time anyway, was also purchasing from dealers. So he was going around to the dealers and buying objects for the national collection from the dealers all over the country. Petrie complained about Bruges, which is kind of interesting, that he was not allowed to keep a lot of small objects that he wanted to keep, because he said that Bruges wanted them to sell in the gift shop. But the reality is kind of complicated, because that sounds, oh, well, that's not good. But Petrie wanted the objects to give to his funders, who paid for his work in Egypt as part of the excavation. So not the big museums, they would get big objects, but for the smaller, because he had a mass of people who were giving him small amounts of money that then would get small objects in return. And he was wanting to have these for them. So they actually were wanting them for almost the same purpose. He was raising money. Bruges' friendship with Myers seems to have gone well beyond a business partnership. So it wasn't just that Myers was buying objects and Bruges was after defeat them to make money to pay for the national collection, which were underfunded. They seem to have met in 1884, and they continued to meet every time Myers was in Egypt. And he went over to the house, he had dinner with the wife. It was a very close working relationship. Myers took all the advice from Bruges. He showed him all his collections before bringing them back, and then Bruges made all the arrangements and did all sorts of things to help save him hassle and money in getting them back to Britain. And we can assume Myers was not the only one that Bruges was doing this for. So I think it's important to think of it in that more global context. And Bruges introduced him to a lot of the major dealers. So helped him know who to trust, who was selling fakes, which were flooding the market at this time. So, you know, it was a very important to the foundation of Myers' collection. Then, as far as the dealers, we know a bit about the dealers that Bruges was introducing Myers to, and he talks a bit about the dealers he goes to. But he basically, from his first days in Cairo, goes out to dealers. He goes around and sees what they've got, checks them out. He did this everywhere he went in Egypt. He did it as, you know, he went down the Nile on his trips. And we know that some of the dealers he visited were considered the best ones to go to. So I picked out two here just to use as examples to show you who he was dealing with and how connected they were to things beyond Myers. So one of them was Mohammed Muhassib, who was the main dealer in Luxor. And just to give you an idea about the role outside of Myers, I've looked at what the British Museum collection has. So here you see two sort of star things from the British Museum. They are purchased by the British Museum from Mohammed Muhassib. And the British Museum records as a source of objects 1,293 objects from that dealer alone. And then another dealer he went to that Myers said was, you know, one of the top for him was Paniotis Hitakis, so Greek, but working in Cairo. And again, this is the British Museum collection to store objects from the collection. The British Museum has 2,901 objects from this dealer alone in the collection. So if you start to think about this beyond Myers and put it out to the fact that this is not happening just at the British, this is happening at Met, this is happening in Berlin, this is happening at all these major places in the world, and start to think about the quantities of things coming through these dealers, it starts to put things into a certain context. Now, these dealers are not the direct excavators. I mean, there were dealers that were closer to the excavations than these people, but they are often getting the objects second and third hand. And so they don't always know where they're from because they're not always told accurately by the people who are bringing them where they're from, because they don't want, you know, them to go out and get them directly behind their back. And then the dealers, if they do know where they're from, might not want to tell people like Myers where they're from because they don't want Myers running out and getting them themselves. So there's this whole sort of secrecy about where things are from sometimes. So items were often from illicit digging, particularly, were broken up. They were given in pieces to two different dealers, or from dealers would give them to different buyers. They also would get groups of objects together. Those groups would sometimes contain art. Let's say if you had a papyrus broken into 3 bits, there might be a basket of papyrus bits, but they would only be one from that one roll, and then another part of it would go in another bundle. So you have to imagine that these dealers are doing what's financially best. And sometimes that doesn't mean keeping objects whole the way we would want to today. So I think it's just it comes into the Myers collection a bit, because that pectoral I showed you in an earlier slide is in 2 pieces, and that's because it went to 2 different buyers from a dealer and then has been reunited more recently. Myers complained at one point that he went around, started going around the dealers in Cairo and realized they didn't have anything. He found out that 2 people from the British Museum had been ahead of him and cleaned out all the good stuff. So, there was a competition to this, and that there was a real market, and the prices did fluctuate, relating to who was coming and how much they were buying and what they wanted. So, another contact to look at in the context of the Myers collection is Karl Reinhardt, and he was a Prussian diplomat and linguistic scholar, specialist in Arabic, who served as a translator at the Prussian consulate in Egypt. And he's known today for his a papyrus he purchased and then gave to the museum in Berlin called the Reinhardt Papyrus, and also the Berlin Codex, which is a Coptic document. And he also gave a number of pieces of more historical Egyptian artistic, so like this head of Akhenaten is in the Berlin collection. That's a Reinhardt gift or that he sold to them. And Reinhardt collected things that in many ways are very similar to what's in the Myers collection. And in fact, Myers has a number of objects that originate with Reinhardt. So the famous wing newt, which is here in Birmingham, but is also just considered one of the classic items within the Myers collection, comes from Reinhardt initially. I mean, it goes through another hand before it gets to Myers, because he initially turned it down because it was too expensive. And then someone else bought it, and then he bought it from them. But Reinhardt is the source for a number of objects, particularly things that are now thought to come from Tuna al-Gebel, which I'll get to later in the talk. Another connection is Henry Wallace. And Henry Wallace was a significant collector. He was older than Myers. Born in 1830, so he's quite senior in some ways, and I think he did serve as a mentor, more on the sort of English side here in the country. And he was instrumental in the formation of major collections at the V&A and at the British Museum. He had his own private collection as well. His early life, he was a painter, and he in fact was a member of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and was a close friend of Rossetti. In fact, the Birmingham City collection has these 2 paintings in it. So this is the Stonebreaker, which is considered as one of his best paintings, and then this is a study for the death of Chatterton. The big painting is in the Tate, but this is in Birmingham. So the museum's closed, so we can't run out and see it, but when it opens back up, I'm sure these will be on display. So he was well known for these paintings, and he, though, had a change in his life where he started doing watercolors, which weren't as prestigious, and then started traveling a lot and got very much into collecting, and particularly ceramics. He first went to Egypt in 1885, so it wasn't that long after Myers was there, and he made visits to Egypt every year till 1901. And he was in regular communication with the keepers both at the V&A and at the British Museum. And in fact, he probably funded his trips partly by going out on buying expeditions for those museums. So they paid him money to go out and buy objects for their collection. He traveled with Wallace Budge, who was the keeper at the British Museum, particularly for the language material. And they were actually, it was him and Budge that were the ones who cleaned out yours. So Wallace was recognized as a skilled illustrator of ancient Egyptian ceramics and museum type objects. And he did participate in excavation. And he's not only considered an expert for Egyptian material, but also for Middle Eastern and European medieval ceramics. Wallace was instrumental in acquiring objects for private collectors and selling to those collectors. And his most famous person that he probably did that for was Reverend McGregor. And we'll come back to McGregor and his collection, but that is one of the most famous collections of ancient Egyptian material ever. Wallace was also very close to Flinders Petrie and was probably the person who introduced Myers to Petrie. And just in the context of all this, Petrie did purchase from the dealers, and he used some of his purchases to give to the funders' foundation. So it's a very complicated picture. Petrie wasn't just excavating and bringing those objects back. So this painting is by Wallace, and it's of Petrie doing his excavating at the Ramesseum. And then this painting is interesting because Myers and Wallace met both in London when they were both there and in Egypt when they were both there. So they didn't always coincide, but when they did, they usually met up, compared notes, talked about their collections. And not only the ancient Egyptian, but they both shared this interest in Islamic and Coptic material. And they went out to the Jewish quarter and were looking at architecture. And this is one of Wallace's paintings from this period of the house in the Jewish quarter. So it might be from when they went together. Wallace was instrumental in organizing a major exhibition of ancient Egyptian artworks at Burlington Club in 1895, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But I just wanted to point out this is a publication of Egyptian ceramics that Wallace did after he published the McGregor collection. He did a general one, and it included quite a few objects from the Myers collection. So here we have a page from the catalog, and this cup is in the Myers collection in a previous slide. This is at the V&A. This is artwork done by Wallace in preparation for this, but not used in it. So this is color. So this cup is in here in Birmingham, and that fragment with the cartouches and the titles below is also here. And then this is a McGregor chalice that he did. So he considering he didn't know hieroglyphs as far as being able to read the language, these show quite a mastery compared to what many people were producing this time when they were trying to reproduce graphically Egyptian objects. So Myers and Wallace were quite, they admired each other's, the objects they were collecting, and they shared a lot of the same interests. The work that was published in 1900, it was this catalog. And if you remember, Myers was killed in 1899. And Wallace notes that it was completed prior to Myers' death. And so I'm just going to read you what he wrote, because I think it gives you a sense of how they cooperated with each other. The following pages had scarcely been set up in type when the writer received the sorrowful intelligence that Major W.J. Myers, whose collection had furnished the subjects for some of the illustrations in this volume, had been killed at Ladysmith. His death will be deplored and his memory will be cherished by a wide circle of friends who valued him for his sterling qualities and loved him for his sweet and amiable disposition. In his short career and during the intervals of his professional duties, he had formed one of the most important collections of Oriental art brought together in the present century. Students of Egyptian art will owe him a lasting debt of gratitude from his having directed that the Egyptian portion of his collection shall be kept intact, and he has bequeathed it to his old school at Eton College, where it will remain amidst the scenes endeared to him by early association, a fitting memorial of a brave soldier and a collector of fine and discriminating taste. It's interesting because the fate of collections was in Wallace's mind after the death of Myers. So in January 1900, Wallace wrote to Charles Reed, the keeper at the British Museum. And he says, "My dear Reed, as usual, I was occupied before leaving London, or I should have come to see you at the BM to tell you of a matter which I think you will be interested. You may have heard that MacGregor has for some time announced his intention of leaving his Egyptian collection to Rugby." That's where he went to school. MacGregor did. "The other day, I happened to mention to him the circumstances of poor Myers having bequeathed his collection to Eton, and with results that have been far from happy. MacGregor then told me he had abandoned the idea of leaving his treasures to Rugby, and now rather thought they would go to the Birmingham Museum. I told him I thought the proposed bequest was most judicious, but suggested that the proper destination for the ceramic section was the BM. So then, later, following up on this, Wallace writes to Reed, "I have written to MacGregor as you suggest, pointing out that although an Egyptian collection would be valuable to the new Birmingham University, yet that the pottery would be practically lost to students at large, and that the college students would take little or no interest in it. I told him that you proposed forming a historical series of glazed artistic ceramic art, for which his collection would make a grand commencement. Indeed, such a one as can be found in no national museum, or perhaps ever will be." And I quoted the precedent of the antique lash. Anyway, so he's, again, trying to push it towards the British Museum. So Birmingham lost out on one of the most amazing collections in the world. Kind of sad to see that. Then he wrote to his son, Harold, an interesting thing in 1901. So again, we're just following, not too far after. "I've made the stipulation respecting sale by auction," this is in his will, "because I should like, if possible, the objects of art to be offered to museums, with the view of keeping them together. I should wish the ancient glass to be offered to the British Museum, the Spanish Moorish and Italian pottery to the Victoria and Albert Museum, and also to the Italian furniture tapestry. The Egyptian pottery and bronzes might be offered to the BM." So he was concerned. We don't know what his reference to the Eton problems were. No idea. Never heard there was a problem, but clearly there was. It influenced MacGregor. And, MacGregor's collection suffered the fate that he was worried about, Wallace was worried about, because the MacGregor collection was sold to a dealer, Spank, who then immediately put it up for auction and it got dispersed. So the collection totally lost, and people are still looking for pieces from it. Sorry, just gonna pop along here. Burlington Club. So the Burlington Club, which I've mentioned in relation to Wallace's activities with this exhibition, Myers was a member of the Burlington Club, and it was a gentleman's club that most middle class and upper class men of the time were members. It was a place to go in London. You could have a meal, socialize, and share interests with the other members. Burlington Club was specifically for those who were interested in the arts. And so it was a place where amateurs and professionals could meet. You didn't have to be a certain class to join. And you would have space to exhibit your objects to other people. There was a reading room with a lot of relevant books. And then every year there was a special exhibition. And so the Egyptian exhibition in 1895 was one of those. So the Burlington Club had a lot of famous members. So there were, Henry Wallace was a member, obviously. Rossetti was a member. J.P. Morgan was a member. W.H. Smith was a member. Lord Carnarvon was a member. So it was a place where Myers could talk about his collection and get a lot of interaction on it. And so when we look at the Burlington Club's exhibition, this case here, almost all of those are Myers objects. And he had an amazing contribution. And this is really the vehicle through which he met Petrie. MacGregor exhibited this. So he was meeting all of these people, all the key collectors here. And there was exchanging going on. Apparently MacGregor did some purchasing coming out of this. I don't have any indication that Myers sold anything, but it was an important element in the sharing of knowledge and collections that had a big impact on Myers. So that's just the exhibition committee. So we have Ehrman, who was head of the Berlin Museum, McGregor, Maspero, head of antiquities in Egypt, Flinders Petrie, Hilton Price, who's a very influential, wealthy collector, and then Henry Wallace. And then these are some of the people who had objects that moved. So as far as the life histories of understanding the objects, one of the things I think from looking at this examination of collectors is that we can see that there was a real blurring of what we now see as divisions. So excavated objects, things from dealers, private donations, government sources, purchases, they're all very blurred during this formative period. And so the categories that we recognize as being different sources, different ways of getting objects would not have been seen that way during this period, and that they made different choices than what we would make today. And these are the kinds of sources that Myers was going to. This is a dealer from the time of Myers in Cairo. And this is the second cache of royal mummies. And objects from these caches did end up in collections. And Myers' collection has some things from the Darrell Buckley cache, the initial one. So things we would think, should not be coming together, they are coming together at this time. And this, because Britain was in control of Egypt at this time, and that the way that the collections were formed were through these sort of weird blurring of illicit and licit activities. This is why Myers is considered a colonial collection. And this comes out sometimes in different reports on the collection. So here we have two headlines. The first one's from the Independent, and this is related to the first time that the exhibition was going on display, the turn of the 21st century. Major Myers' confidential hoard of Egyptian plunder finally goes on show. The content of the article does not reflect that headline. It says nothing about plunder or hoards or anything, but it's definitely caught your attention. The other one is about the Durban mummy, and this is more recent. It says calls for the return of looted Egyptian artifacts. Durban mummy wants to give back the 2000 Durban Museum. Within the article, though, it's much more explicit. It says Myers brought the mummy from Egypt when he came to South Africa at the end of the 19th century, having served in Egypt for 5 years. It is believed that Myers, who built up the finest 19th century private collection of ancient Egyptian antiquities, which he bequeathed to his old school, Britain's famous Eton College, according to the Egyptian Society of South Africa, stole and smuggled the artifacts out of Egypt. So after I think this sort of discussion of the collectors and what we know of how Myers formed his collection, we know that these characterizations are not accurate reflections of the acquisition of the collection. And certainly with the recent contemplation of return of objects to the countries of origin, like the Parthenon marbles, there's been calls for the Rosetta Stone, Sphinx's beard to go back, that these things now are things that need to be discussed. Looting and plunder is normally reserved for theft of items, usually by force and during war. The situation with Myers and much of the acquisition of objects from Egypt during the last decades of the 19th century by private collectors and museums was pretty much the same. And so these were, while gray by modern standards, were at the time were purchased and exported legally with government sanction. This does not change the colonial context of the activities of that collector. It's still a colonial context, but it's not the way that it's being presented. And I think that is important to make those kind of distinctions and look at the more nuanced view of what's going on. So the last thing I want to do is just look at one category of object, to look at how knowing this background can help us bring some of the life story of the object back. This is to look at the relief chalices. So these two chalices are here in Birmingham. They're not what I would call relief chalices. They are lotus chalices of two different types, but they are related to this, which is a relief chalice. This one is in the Eton collection, but is at Eton College. It's not here. And these are quite rare. And that's why it's interesting to have a look at this as a category to play out how would you go about using what we know about all these ways that miners collected and the people in contact with to learn more about these objects. So these relief chalices are spread in museums in USA, in UK, and Berlin. And they, as far as I know, there are no excavated examples. They all are from some form of purchase. And they have connections to Myers, Reinhardt, Wallace, McGregor, and Petrie on the whole. Those are the main, there's a couple other maybe connections, but those are the main people connected with these objects. So just want to go through the ones, a few examples of what's in the collection. So this is ECM 816, so the Eton collection, the Myers collection, and it is a composite of fragments to reconstruct a vessel. And this was looked at by a former curator of the collection at Eton named Tate. And so this black and white is his publication and where he explains where things are from. And then this is the as it is now. So what we've got is fragments from these different museums all coming together to make one chalice. So the Berlin fragment, which is this one up here, was destroyed in the war. So they superimposed a photo, but it doesn't exist anymore. Then we have in this picture, you can see this sort of whitish, that's a cast, and that's a cast of a fragment that's in the Walters Art Museum. And then some of the other fragments are Eton ones, and then there's also some that were in Truro, in Cornwall. Now, we have the Eton ones and Myers. The others, the ones Reinhardt was given by Reinhardt, and then the other ones might be McGregor. Now, Truro sold their fragments. I don't know if they sold all of them that are in the Tate article in the 80s to the Metropolitan Museum in New York. So those fragments may now be in New York. And we have this is ECM 79. And as you can see from the publication by Tate, we've got a Reinhardt fragment in Berlin. We've got the Myers one, which is this one here. And then these two are from the Metropolitan Museum. They came to the Metropolitan Museum through Lord Carnarvon. And Lord Carnarvon may have bought a McGregor lot, the famous lot 293, which had 22 fragments of blue and green faience chalices. That's the description in the catalog. So it's vague enough, we don't know. That may have been dispersed because it wasn't bought initially by Carnarvon. He purchased it later. It was bought by another dealer and then dispersed again. So we seek to come back then again to probably McGregor as to the source of how these got there, but they came through Carnarvon. And Carnarvon did buy a large portion of McGregor items, which then the majority of those ended up at the Metropolitan Museum. Now, the Metropolitan Museum of New York has reconstructed this chalice, apparently. I could not get a picture of it, but they bought another fragment that was sold in the 1980s by Sotheby's, which the source was given as McGregor as well. But beyond that, I don't know how it sort of randomly found its way through all of that process. But I don't have a picture of it. But again, it's all the same people and all the same sort of sources coming together. Then we have this fragment, which is ECM 993. This was bought by Eton at Phillips Auctions in the 1980s. They didn't know about it, but it is a very, very strong match for this chalice, which was bought by Wallace at Tunel Gebel in the 1890s and sold to McGregor. So this it's not necessarily from that chalice, but it could be. It's totally unknown, but it's very, very close, and they aren't too many that are that close to each other. And then in the collection, we have a bunch of fragments, these 4 little fragments from Carnarvon that were given to Eton College. Now, Carnarvon was an Eton College boy, so it makes sense, but these could be McGregor as well then. There's no indication, but they're so tiny, it's very hard to link to anything. And this is another group of things at the Met that seem to have all gone through the same. Some of them are Carnarvon bequests that ended up in New York, but then we also have things that were from Truro that make up this. So these fragments got so disassociated with each other, they ended up in all these different museums, but it actually comes down to very few people: Wallace, Myers, and McGregor, and Reinhardt. And Reinhardt was supplying Myers, and Reinhardt may have given them, and Wallace was supplying Myers. So we come down to just a couple people, and those 2 people, Reinhardt and Wallace, say that they come from Tunel Gebel. So what, in conclusion, this all kind of leads up to is that there seems to be, if they come from Tunel Gebel, that there was a very singular source, maybe even one tomb, but one deposit that came up all at one time and is the source for all of these, but they got distributed through so that they were sold in separate batches, and then it's only more recently that they've been able to be matched up. Tunel Gebel is a site that's under excavation, but it's largely Greco-Roman. There's not very much third intermediate period there, and these chalices seem to date to the 3rd intermediate period. We know that from another fragment that's from the Myers collection that actually has a cartouche on it. And it's the cemetery for Hermopolis, which is, again, a really, really important site in ancient Egypt, but not well understood and not widely excavated. And it's opposite to Amarna. So it's in a very interesting central location in Egypt. So it's only through putting all these pieces together that you can really reconstruct these chalices and get a broad selection of them and really link them back to Tunel Gebel so that people are kind of confident. And in fact, Petrie bought a couple chalices as well. And he calls them tunaware. So then what we've got then, the Myers collection, is that it's possible, if you start to track these things down and look at where the comparable collections to ones that Myers has, to the sources Myers is using, that you can then put together life stories. And there's been, besides the chalices, there's been a few other attempts at this with objects, but they rely on getting together the museum records that go with the museums and the collectors we know that Myers was connected to, but also letters and diaries. So some of the letters from Wallace that I read to you have only been published within the last couple of years. And the vast majority of his letters are not published. And they only arrived at the Bodleian fairly recently. So this is a vast wealth of information to yet be mined. And just this is the Myers Shabti, and then this is one that's in the collection here. And it's possible if they start connecting these things that we can learn more about these Shabtis, because they're very orphaned, basically. We don't know whose tomb they're from or anything about the people, but their names are on them. So it's hopeful that if more and more of this work gets done, that more information and maybe more provenance for these objects can be found, and that we can link up an object in another collection with the Myers object and start to look at, is there information about where that object's from? Do they have records? Are they connected to diaries or letters or other information that then can give us? So in the end, why study collectors? I think it's hopefully, even though this was sort of a short, quick, rough overview, that by studying collectors, you can learn a lot more, not only about the objects, but the method of acquisition, and that we can get more nuanced and clear understandings of collecting under this colonial system that tell us a lot about this really formative period for most of our big museum collection, and that this will impact interpretation of collections in museums, inform policy decisions within institutions on what to do with this material, and for private individuals holding such collections, maybe releasing private letters and diaries more readily, and for government bodies, and that relates to some of the decisions that are being made right now about the British Museum collection and how.
No, I think we do a couple questions.
Yeah, it's over time.
Okay.
So yeah.
If anyone on Zoom has questions, feel free to let me know. Okay. Do you have any questions?
Lindsay, talking all evening. Well, thank you so much for this overview to this collection of collectors at the Eton Myers. I mean, I've got so many questions bubbling in my mind right now. So one of the things that you have illustrated really nicely is how a collection is never the work of a single collector. It's really a network of people that play a role in acquiring those objects and creating meaning around those objects as well. One thing that I find particularly interesting about the Myers collection is that it's not just limited to things that were collected by Myers at that time. That collection got added over time with material from other collectors. So could you tell us a bit more about collections, the collection of collectors of Myers beyond Myers and his time?
Yeah. So Percy Newberry gave a number of objects, and he was one of the first people to come in and look at the collection from an Egyptological perspective and try and help Eton deal with this collection. And he then donated a lot ceramics and things that fit with what Myers had. So it's like the Myers collection shaped what people donated after. So I don't think Carnarvon would ever have given those fragments, except that he knew that Myers had a number of leaf talus fragments and whole pieces, and he thought it would add to the collection. So the collection itself grew through people seeing what Myers had given and either thinking, oh, like I think Seton Card gave me all those stone tools is because there weren't many stone tools, but or there were only the beautiful gold embellished fancy tools, and he wanted to give a broader range, so he gave quite a large section of his collection. And Newberry, the things that Newberry gave are more examples of the same in general. So I think, the collection shapes how people donate now
Yeah, this is fascinating. We tend to think of one collectors who shape the collection, but it's also collections themselves that are shaping how collectors approach that donation acquisition of objects. Fascinating.
Yeah, and the Eton College, they're not a traditional museum, so they're taking donations from they're generally alumni or connected people. They don't, in some ways, have the same choices that a national museum would have, where they're acquiring, they turn down a lot more, I guess is the way to put it. And so they will turn things down if they think it doesn't add to the collection in the way they want to curate the collection. But I don't think Eton does that.
You mentioned briefly that so he was not from aristocracy and that he didn't have any academic interests in Egyptology.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk a bit more about this? Like, does he, like, he never tries to understand, like, person what it meant or the importance of the objects at the time? You mentioned, like, for instance, when he got Shaktis, for instance, would he be interested, like, why are they, who are those little Shaktis with, or like, no?
We don't know.
Interest,
We don't know, to be totally honest. I have not read all of his diaries, only having just read them. But they don't comment on that kind of thing. And certainly Wallace had more knowledge about ancient Egypt, but they were collecting with a slightly different mindset.
Right.
And so they were very much interested in, and again, this relates to being a colonial collection, in seeing the great march of human development. And so this was a stage in that bigger thing. And that fits with the rest of their collecting in some ways. They were collecting things from all different periods, and they were seeing it as a developmental thing. So that's part of it. And some of it's technology driven. He's very interested, I think, though he doesn't not necessarily explicit, but just from looking at the collection at the development of ceramic and glass technology. And some of it is very art driven, that he's just interested in artistic pieces. And he does comment on being shown things and turning things down. There, his taste.
You mentioned like he was part of the club and he would meet like archaeologists like Petrie or like,
Yeah.
so it would be good.
He talked to Budge, and I think he was interested. But it doesn't really impact his collecting the way that, let's say, Petrie was collecting. He's not looking at it to say, I want a series of stamp seals and all these, that kind of, we call it encyclopedia. But, Petrie had much more of that idea of trying to really understand the objects in the cultural context. I don't think it was quite the same.
I can keep going on. You have illustrated very, very nicely how we can use documentation, such as, for example, diaries, in order to try and dig a couple of some information about these objects and the provenance of these objects. Something that I think is fascinating as well are objects themselves, in the sense that, for example, how they're mounted. We're showing a Shakti at the very end, which came in a mountain. I don't know whether we have information about how those are mounted, when they are mounted, whether we have any labels that ever came with the objects. I mean, we do have that mummy, that Maya's mummy from the Durban that you were showing, that obviously came with a label, and that label, we don't know where it came from. So do the objects also contribute to rewriting that story about where they come from and what the context is?
I haven't dug into that. Right. So that has that label on it. And there's a lot of them with that says that it's from a collection of Mars. It has a date on it, but we don't know whether the date is when we collected it or when it was exhibited, or we don't. I don't know if Eton has that information, but we don't have it. So there are a lot of these numbers that are on the objects, which normally relate to some kind of exhibition or, cataloging. That's a very British Museum kind of mount. These show signs, the ones that are here in Birmingham anyway, of having some of the shrubberies of having been glued into something, but none of that. Somebody's cleaned up the collection, and so we don't have much information about how these things. And I'd be very curious to know if Eton has information about what the collection looked like when it was at the house, at Myers' house, because we used to bring students over from Eton. He had a house near Eton. He'd bring students over and show them the collections. So I'd love to know. I think it would be really interesting to know some of that. But Myers, again, mentions in the diaries of writing labels for the Burlington show in 1895. So I don't know what he was writing and where that went. Whether it was, the displays don't show any of that information, and the text in the catalog is quite limited. I don't know if that's what he was writing or if he was writing more. There's so much to follow. And that's why I said that, just being very brief. There's just so many lines of inquiry. It's quite exciting.
You would make a very good student project.
Yes.
We do have a Zoom question.
Okay.
Stephen, I believe, wanted to ask. Feel free to unmic. I think we can hear you from here.
Stephen, did you have a question?
Not so much a question, but you were saying no one knows where some of these artifacts went from the McGregor collection. I recall in 2001 that 2 mummies were said to be under the McDonald's cafe in Tamworth. Apparently that McGregor had originally buried them in his garden at Bowl Hall Manor, and they started to deteriorate and smell a bit. So in 1935, when they were doing something to the Palace Cinema, he had them buried by his gardener in the foundations of the new building. And that was brought down in about 2000 for building McDonald's, and all this appeared on the news in the Tamworth Herald and on the BBC. But another one of the objects is Steely, hung in what used to be his house, Bowlall Manor, when that became a social club. And it was in the foyer for many years. And another one was on Tony Leahy's desk.
Mm-hmm.
I
don't know what happened to that. I presume it's still in the university.
It's in the Caha Museum right now. Don't know if you can hear me, but
I'm glad it's got a home.
what did you say?
Glad it has a home. Yeah.
Well, I think we'll have to call it there. Thank you very much again. That was wonderful and very good.